Our protesters are starting to take to the streets in Russia today in support of the opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who is gravely ill in prison following his decision to launch a hunger strike. Well, let's get the latest on all these developments with our chief foreign editor, Rob Parsons. Rob, just tell us a bit more about what we should read into those protests that are just starting as we speak in Russia. What's the significance of them?
Well, it's difficult to say just at this point because we don't really have a clear picture of what's been taking place across the country. We do know that in Siberia, in Irkutsk, for instance, in Novosibirsk, there have been demonstrations, but in the low thousands. And in the Far East, in Magadan and Vladivostok, demonstrations again in the low thousands. Not many arrests, interestingly, but the spotlight inevitably is going to be on what happens in the big cities further west, in Moscow, St. Petersburg in particular. And already, apparently, Russian police are closing down the streets and squares, including the square where Vladimir Putin was speaking not very long ago, the Manege Square in central Moscow, where it is planned to hold a rally at 7 o'clock local time this evening. So at this stage, it's hard to really say just how successful or unsuccessful this call for demonstrations today has been. We do know that the authorities have arrested Lyubov Sobol and Kirill Yarmesh, who is the press spokesperson for Navalny. Sobol was stopped in her taxi this morning, apparently, by the police and taken away. So quite clearly the police are taking this very seriously. They want to nip it in the bud. They want to make sure that there isn't a sizable demonstration that would clearly indicate to the rest of the world and to the Russian people that there is a sizable sense of dissatisfaction in Russia with the direction in which Vladimir Putin is leading his country.
Yeah, and just before we crossed you, we heard President Putin issuing a pretty direct threat to Western powers. Just tell us a little bit more about the context in which that threat comes in.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about the threats that he made, which were quite vague, it has to be said, were that they came within the context of a speech in which he scarcely touched on foreign policy. Most of his speech was dedicated to social issues, for the need to respond to the privations that had occurred as a consequence, in part at least, of the pandemic, improving healthcare, improving education, trying to increase the demographic level of the country, and so on and so forth. But in a brief couple of statements, including that clip that you ran, Putin did refer to unspecified threats and unspecified red lines. This in the context, obviously, of what's happening in Ukraine, the big build-up on the border with Ukraine of Russian troops, somewhere in the region of 100,000 soldiers, apparently, and also the sanctions imposed by the United States and more recently by the Czech Republic after tracing an explosion in 2014 as a munitions dump to Russian spies. So there is this wider context of tension between the West and Russia, and Putin is saying, look, we've been very restrained, modest in our response, but don't interpret that as being weakness. We have our red lines without actually specifying them, and if they're crossed, then there will be a tough, fast response to those.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us. Our chief foreign editor, Rob Parsons. Thank you so much.